Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast. I'm your host, Nick Giordano, and I'm glad you could join me today. If you're not already a subscriber, make sure to subscribe and follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, don't forget to visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends. We have to inform other people what's going on out there because a lot of them are clueless. And before I jump into today's topic, I just want to go back to last week where we discussed the war on free speech in America. And I have to say, when I posted on social media, the reactions were interesting, to put it mildly. And while most supported what I had to say, there were a few people, particularly on LinkedIn, that have no problem with censorship. They believe free speech shouldn't be a fundamental God-given right and that the government has the right to dictate what we can and cannot say. It's alarming, to say the least. I mean, there are so many out there that think the exact same way that these people do. They say free speech doesn't cover lies and misinformation. So now let's put aside the fact that it actually does cover that. And when I ticked off examples of how factual information was censored and how the government engages in misinformation, they didn't try to refute anything I said. They just try to attack me. They just regurgitate that censorship is a myth. It's part of this vast right-wing conspiracy. And when you ask them, who gets to determine what's a lie or misinformation? They simply ignore the question, regurgitate their own BS. But it was literally 3 days after I released the episode that our friend Hillary Clinton comes out and proves exactly what I'm warning about. Take a listen to what she had to say.
Platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter X or Instagram or TikTok, whatever they are, if they don't moderate and monitor the content, we lose total control. And it's not just the social and psychological effects, it's real harm.
And that's what it's all about. Let's be honest. It's about control. Do I like lies and misinformation? Obviously not. But do I want some government bureaucrat to determine what can and cannot be said? 100% no. Too many government bureaucrats have become nothing more than ideologues, and they have proven themselves to be largely incompetent. And that's what I want to focus on in this episode. This topic is so important, and it shouldn't matter whether you lean left, right, shouldn't matter whether you're somewhere in between, independent, libertarian. We all know the government is big. We all know it's bureaucratic, and the bureaucracy has usurped an enormous amount of power, not just from the states, not just from our direct representatives, but most importantly from we the people. But what happens when it's not just big and bureaucratic, but what happens when it's utterly incompetent at the very same time? What happens when the very agencies and departments that are supposed to serve us can't seem to get anything right? From natural disasters to national security, our government is plagued with systemic failures, and the worst part is that we're seeing a pattern of how deeply entrenched this incompetence is in almost every facet of the federal government, particularly leadership within the federal government. We don't have leaders anymore. That's clear. And in today's episode, I'm going to be exploring about 10 glaring examples of government incompetence that are costing you, me, and every other taxpayer trillions of dollars each year. And these aren't just isolated incidents or simple mistakes. These are colossal failures that have far-reaching consequences. And the more you hear, the more you're going to start to wonder, what exactly are we paying for here? Where's our return on investment? Because I'm not seeing much. These failures are happening while trillions of tax dollars are being wasted. Trillions. The federal government collects and spends these trillions each year. So why are we getting so little in return? Why does it feel like things are getting worse, not better? And why do so few Americans care? I think that's the most upsetting of all, that you have so many Americans that just simply brush it off. Well, it's government. But it's not just about the money. It's also about trust. How can we trust our departments and agencies when they consistently fail? When no one is ever held accountable? When those in power have proven themselves to be ideologues rather than public servants? When they have proven to be thoroughly incompetent? How can we trust them? Now, we're not allowed to say that because if you ask that question, you get attacked that you're hurting democracy, you're a threat to democracy. But it's our job to ask these questions, and it's our job to demand answers. So after the break, we're going to explore those questions. And I'm going to go through it all, starting with FEMA's disastrous response to Hurricane Helene. And trust me, you are not going to want to miss this. It is going to be eye-opening. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back, everyone. So today we are focusing on the crisis of government incompetence, and I want to set the stage right off the bat. There are some who think that everything we're witnessing, all these failures, that it's intentional. But if you believe that, you're giving way too much credit to these people. Most are not smart enough for it to be intentional. And much of it can be explained just through complete incompetence. Now, it's not to say that there aren't nefarious actors within our government. But the reality is that there's many more incompetent officials than anything else. Right now, people in North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee are suffering. And you're about to see Hurricane Milton slam into Florida, and FEMA has been an absolute disaster. Now, usually I am hesitant to criticize emergency response operations because I've been there. I know what it's like. It's a thankless job. I know how complicated disaster response can be, particularly at the beginning of any natural disaster. And when you have this amount of destruction on this scale, it's definitely not easy to manage. And no matter what you do, there's going to be some criticism coming at you. And you have to accept that as an emergency manager. Emergency response is never going to be perfect, but there is no doubt that FEMA dropped the ball here. They were totally unprepared for this disaster. And listen, I've had Steve Kerr on my podcast numerous times. You all know he was my mentor in emergency management. Preparedness was his main priority, and his philosophy was you ramp up and you be prepared. And if disaster doesn't strike, you can always scale back, but you are prepared for the worst possible scenario that's going to unfold so that you could respond appropriately. But if you're caught off guard, the consequences are disastrous. And that's exactly what we saw with FEMA's response to Hurricane Helene. They failed to ramp up in time, they left communities vulnerable, and the result was chaos. The result was delayed relief and unnecessary suffering. And this is not how emergency management is supposed to work. Yet that's FEMA under Secretary Mayorkas. That's FEMA under the administrator, Deanne Criswell. Their leadership has failed. Resources were never pre-positioned adequately, personnel levels were inadequate, and we see failed coordination between the federal, state, and local government. Yet here was Secretary Mayorkas just a few months ago assuring Americans that FEMA was prepared for hurricane season. Take a listen.
FEMA is tremendously prepared. This is what we do. This is what they do. And the key here, Rebecca, is also to make sure that the communities who are potentially impacted are prepared as well. And it's not just hurricanes and wildfires, also extreme heat, which certainly some parts of the United States are already experiencing.
Now, obviously, you weren't tremendously prepared. That's clear. It took days for FEMA to set up, and we're nearly 2 weeks out, and you have residents that are finally starting to see officials roll in. Unacceptable. Unacceptable. These are Americans. And even worse, they tried to hinder volunteers from going into these areas to conduct search and rescue, distribute supplies, and help with response efforts. Now, that's the beauty of America, that when disaster strikes, Americans are willing to volunteer, put themselves at risk to help other Americans. That's what makes America an exceptional nation. But they wouldn't allow that. They tried to hinder that. And if you say that out loud, they accuse you of pushing misinformation. But it's not misinformation. It's the truth. And you don't have to take my word for it. There are countless people who live in these areas that have been putting out videos pleading for help. There are countless videos from volunteers who explain just how FEMA and other federal agencies try to hinder them and prevent them from helping. Now, I'm not saying that you believe every video out there that exists. Obviously, there's a lot of BS out there, and you have to sort through and figure out what's right or wrong. Not the government. You have to sort through it. But are we really going to say that all these individuals who are on the ground, all these individuals that suffered the wrath of Hurricane Helene, that they're lying, that they're just making this up, that FEMA and state officials are the only ones telling the truth? That is absurd on every single level. These are people on the ground that are witnessing the failures firsthand. Their voices matter, and their experience reveal stark reality of the bureaucratic incompetence that exists, and ignoring them or dismissing them, telling their accounts are just simply misinformation is just another way to cover up the truth, because they don't want the truth to exist anymore. And it's time to hold FEMA and our government accountable for their failures rather than silencing those who expose those failures. You see the attacks on whistleblowers from other agencies getting demonized, punished. Garrett O'Boyle, Steve Friend, Marcus Allen, IRS whistleblowers like Gary Shapley and Joseph Ziegler. We see it. We see them getting attacked. In our new government, in Orwell's dystopian 1984 that's here now, you're not allowed to criticize government agencies. You're not allowed to criticize the department. You're not allowed to criticize FEMA, according to Administrator Campbell. Take a listen to what she had to say.
It has a tremendous impact on the comfort level of our own employees to be able to go out there, but it's also demoralizing to all of the first responders that have been out there in their communities helping people, FEMA staff, volunteers, the private sector that are working side by side with local officials to go out and help people. I need to make sure I can get the resources to where they're needed. And when you have this dangerous rhetoric like you're hearing, it creates fear in our own employees. We need to make sure we're getting help to the people who need it.
What nerve. This isn't about the work of the first responders and what they're doing. It's not about the FEMA employees that are deployed on the ground. It's about the failures in leadership. It's about failures to plan, prepare, train, and exercise long before a disaster like this hits. But everyone in government is too busy focusing on making sure their employees are well trained on white privilege, white rage, implicit bias, and inherent racism rather than doing their damn jobs. And the state-sponsored media does nothing more than push the government talking points. Rather than push government talking points, they should have their reporters on the ground immediately following the disaster. Remember during Katrina, every outlet had entire teams, but you don't see any media doing that anymore because they don't care about the truth. That's why they're not on the ground. They don't want to know the truth. They could easily send their reporters down there to see what's really happening, but where are they? And if they aren't there, how can they say that the people on the ground, the people who are suffering, how are they going to say that those people are lying and pushing misinformation? Truly astonishing. And you're going to see what happens. You know, the media is now going to trickle in 2 weeks later, 2 weeks after the disaster hits, and they're going to say, look, FEMA's here. They're all over the place. We told you that they were here, and anyone that says otherwise, well, they were just pushing disinformation. But the truth is that FEMA was too slow to respond right from the start when it was most important, and the military should have been on standby before even the impact of the storm. They should have been able to deploy in the immediate aftermath. Yet it took the Biden-Harris administration a week to give the order, and it's indisputable. There are a number of people in emergency management who I speak with, and they agree with me. You know, during Hurricane Sandy, when we responded to that, we had the military out there as the storm hit. They were ready to go once Sandy passed, and they were extremely helpful. But like always, the state-sponsored media simply wants to push the government talking points rather than do real journalism. And ask Secretary Mayorkas why he said that FEMA was prepared for hurricane season 3 months ago, and now he claims FEMA is broke. Take a listen to this.
Meeting the immediate needs with the money that we have. We are expecting another hurricane hitting. We do not have the funds. FEMA does not have the funds to make it through the season.
This is their words, not mine. That's why I play these sound clips, so you could hear it directly from their mouths. And they want to shift blame. If FEMA was broke, why didn't Secretary Mayorkas sound the alarm bells months ago? And why did he say FEMA was prepared for hurricane season if they really weren't? And I'll tell you why, because it's all BS. And now you have another firestorm brewing because Republicans and former President Trump have accused Secretary Mayorkas and FEMA officials of spending over $1 billion on migrants when that money could have been used for disaster response. Of course, the administration, the Democrats, and the media accused anyone who brings this up as racist or xenophobic, they're bigots, and they say it's categorically false, labeling it misinformation once again. You see that label keep coming out. They say that Trump and the Republicans are doing nothing more than promoting hate based on false information. And again, if journalists had any amount of integrity, they can actually do their job and investigate. It's not hard to find out who's lying and who's telling the truth. It's really not that difficult. They want to play wordsmith games. And here is what White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre said just a few days ago. Take a listen to her.
No, Biden did not take FEMA relief money to use on migrants.
Now, here's what Karine Jean-Pierre said back all the way in 2022. Take a listen and I'll explain the wordsmithing after this.
So FEMA regional administrators have been meeting with city officials on site to coordinate available federal support from FEMA and other federal agencies. Funding is also available through FEMA's emergency food and shelter program to eligible local governments and non-for-profit organizations upon request to support humanitarian relief for migrants.
So she clearly stated that FEMA has allocated money for illegal immigrants under FEMA's emergency food and sheltering program. Now, can someone please remind me what the people in North Carolina, Tennessee, and certain places in Georgia need right now? I'm just saying. And in full disclosure, FEMA's emergency food and shelter program gives money to local governments and nonprofits to provide assistance to American citizens who are experiencing or at risk of experiencing hunger, homelessness, and it's used a lot of times for non-disaster related emergencies. And the left is going to scream, see, Professor, the Republicans are lying. They're spreading misinformation and you're trying to deceive your audience because this money is used for non-disaster related emergencies. Well, first of all, the Emergency Food and Shelter Program is supposed to provide assistance to American citizens, number one, not illegal immigrants. And my response is that my audience gets full disclosure from me. I don't need to lie and manipulate. The truth is that the administration can shuffle money around based on emergencies, and this money can be used for disaster-related assistance if necessary. So while KJP says that no money was taken from emergency response activities, she's not telling you the whole truth, that the money could have been shifted if necessary. And just look at how President Biden ignored a Supreme Court order for student debt forgiveness, and don't sit there and tell me that he couldn't shift money around when he could blatantly disregard a Supreme Court order, pay off student loans, put that on the back of taxpayers, people that paid off their student debt, paid for their college, maybe even never went to college. Okay, this money could have been shifted. And then you have Secretary Mayorkas. Take a listen to what Secretary Mayorkas said in 2023.
FEMA is going to be playing a pivotal role in our shelter and services program that is poised to distribute $363 million to cities and communities in need of funding.
And just so you know from that clip, that was $363.8 million taxpayer dollars in fiscal year 2023. For fiscal year 2024, it was an additional $650 million. And again, in full disclosure, FEMA's Shelter and Services Program allocates to provide assistance to migrants following their release from the Department of Homeland Security. But also, again, that money could easily be shifted to take care of Americans in a disaster. And it's indisputable that FEMA spent over $1 billion taxpayer dollars to feed and shelter illegal immigrants. Are they separate funding streams? Yes, they are. But who cares? Whether or not the money was taken from disaster response to fund illegal immigrants is actually irrelevant. As I stated, the money could easily be shifted. And this is what happens when you open the borders and allow 10 to 15 million people who have no skills, no self-support mechanisms to flood into this country over a 3-year period. We see the incompetence of FEMA. We see the incompetence of the Department of Homeland Security in securing the border. And the American people are the ones paying the price. And $1 billion is just a drop in the bucket. According to the House GOP, they issued a report on the Biden-Harris border crisis, and they state in the report that it has cost the American taxpayers $451 billion. $451 billion. Think about that, $500 billion. And every American should ask themselves, why don't Americans and legal permanent residents of the United States matter? Why don't they matter? And some are going to argue and say, well, that's a Republican report, so of course they're going to lie and feed you misinformation. But that's nonsense. Because according to the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, when it comes to emergency medical services alone, they estimate that Medicaid spending on illegal aliens has cost the taxpayers more than $16.2 billion since 2021. Now, when you factor in the cost of education for more than 500,000 of school-age kids entering our public schools, the housing, the food, the debit cards, other social welfare programs, law enforcement, incarceration. You factor all those in and you see how quickly the number rises to hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars. But the government incompetence doesn't end there. It's actually just the beginning. And I'll talk about that when we get back from this quick break. So hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So I'm just getting started here. I just reamed FEMA, DHS, and we might as well stick with the Department of Homeland Security because in the last few months, we have seen not one, but two assassination attempts on a former president. And I'm not going to harp on this because I've spoken about the first and second attempts in previous episodes. I have the links up in the show notes of this episode, so you can check those episodes out. I suggest you listen to them. It's really important. But when we look at the assassination attempts, just because the former president wasn't killed doesn't mean that Secret Service was successful. Yes, the agents that jumped on Trump with the first assassination attempt were heroes. They performed well under fire. The agent that foiled the second attempt did an outstanding job. However, the fact that two individuals were able to get this close to a former president and a current presidential candidate is another example of total incompetence. And why the hell does Mayorkas still have a job? He is an abject failure that has destroyed the Department of Homeland Security, and we need to begin to have a real conversation of whether the Department of Homeland Security needs to be dismantled at this point. Its tentacles have gotten too long, they have routinely abused their power, and many within DHS, particularly the leadership, have proven that they are nothing more than incompetent ideologues. Mayorkas has to go. He destroyed the Department of Homeland Security. And then we look to the Department of Defense. And I know I say it a lot on this podcast, but we can never forget the 20 years of war where defense officials, State Department officials, intelligence officials told us for 20 years that we were making progress, that the Afghan government was stable and the Afghan security forces can hold the country. Then after 20 years of war, $2 trillion in tax dollars spent, for over 2,400 soldiers coming back in flag-draped coffins, within a week of announcing our withdrawal, the Taliban easily recaptures the country. And they are better armed and equipped today than prior to 9/11. And how many Americans and Afghans that helped us were left behind? Where Americans, former soldiers, nonprofit organizations, they went on their own to Afghanistan. They volunteered, put themselves at risk to try and get the Americans left behind out of Afghanistan. Americans who were left behind had to rely on other Americans, not our government, because our government abandoned them, because our government is filled with incompetent officials that abandoned them. Now, when we look at the Afghanistan debacle, understand this did enormous harm to America's image, and it's the precise reason we are seeing so much global instability today. You want to talk about government incompetence and failures? There you go right there. And while we're at it, let's move on to the State Department, where from the moment the Biden-Harris administration came to office, they allowed China to dictate to us about human rights. They lectured us on human rights, a country with one of the worst human rights records on the planet, a country that silences and censors their people routinely, a country that literally locked people in their apartment buildings during the coronavirus, a country that has re-education camps, which are nothing more than torture and death camps for the Uyghurs, dictating to us about human rights. Do you think anyone on the world stage takes President Biden and Vice President Harris, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan remotely serious? Do you think that's part of the reason our adversaries got much more aggressive? They could have avoided Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I said Russia was preparing to invade all the way back in April 2021, nearly a year before they launched the invasion. And check out the episode. The link's in the show notes. But rather than do their jobs and actually engage in diplomacy, it seems that they were busy with other things. Begging Iran to come to the table for the nuclear negotiations, giving Iran all this money. Then we had to beg an adversary, Venezuela, to produce more oil for us, despite us having the capability to produce our own oil in a much cleaner and more efficient way. So pathetic. Let's look at the incompetence and the nefariousness of the FBI, a once proud agency that has become nothing more than the Democrat Party's apparatchik. As they wasted time focusing on parents attending school board meetings, traditional Catholics who only believe in two genders, Trump supporters, the amorphous threat of white supremacy that they never define, never label the groups, never show who the leaders of these groups are, don't tell us what the operational command and control is, nothing. They never define it. Yet we still have no idea about the motivation behind the 2017 Las Vegas shooter, Stephen Paddock. We know virtually nothing about the guy. All these years later, we have no idea about the two people that tried to kill the former president, and both their backgrounds are just bizarre. It doesn't make any sense. And we know nothing about them. We still don't know anything about the pipe bomber from January 6th that left pipe bombs at the Democrat National Committee and the Republican National Committee headquarters down in Washington, D.C. Think about that. At the time, the current vice president, who is now a candidate to be the president of these United States, was at the Democrat National Committee headquarters while the pipe bomb was there, and yet the FBI hasn't even released if they have any suspects in the case. In the words of Joe Biden.
Come on, give me a break, man.
Let's move on to the Department of Transportation, how the government passed a $1 trillion taxpayer-funded infrastructure bill. $1 trillion. And you want to talk about government failure and wasted taxpayer dollars? This bill was passed in November of 2021. $7.5 billion of your money was allocated to build electric charging stations throughout the country. It's now 3 years later. Guess how many they built? Guess. Some of you may think hundreds, others may be thinking thousands. But the truth is a total of 8 electric charging stations have been built from the $7.5 billion that were allotted to that. A whopping 8. I couldn't even make up this incompetence if I tried. But it's not just about charging stations. Under the same bill, $42 billion was allocated to expand broadband throughout the United States. Yet as of today, not a single household, not a single person has been connected to the internet through this program. And you have the Biden-Harris administration saying that the projects won't even start now until 2025. Well, here's an idea. Maybe FEMA can use that money to help the victims of Hurricane Helene. Maybe they could do that. Maybe instead of the $600 that Maui residents got, maybe they could help the Maui residents rebuild. Use that money. I mean, this should be completely unacceptable and illustrates gross incompetence of our government. We can look at how the Biden and Harris administration's American Rescue Plan triggered an enormous amount of inflation. And while inflation has slowed, understand that the prices are still up anywhere from 20 to 50% on necessities, food, energy, insurance. And then you had Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen come out, oh, the inflation, it's just transitory. It's going to quickly subside, yet here we are 3 years later dealing with its impacts as our household budgets, our livelihoods have been decimated. But don't worry, they keep on telling you that the economy is on fire, that Bidenomics has brought us the best economy ever, just like Scarborough said this was the best Biden ever. And then they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, spent another $1 trillion, had nothing to do with inflation, everything to do with the green energy fanatics. The failures are across the board. You can move on to the Department of Education and the decline of our education system. They colluded with Fauci, the CDC, the NIH, teacher union leaders, Randy Weingarten, to keep kids out of school for nearly 2 years. Nearly 2 years. They did enormous amounts of damage to an entire generation, stealing the youth. They socially isolated them, set them back in terms of both academic and social development. And today, they're suffering as a result. They are suffering from a mental health crisis of epic proportions. They're socially inept. They're depressed. They're anxious. They're lonely. Academic proficiency levels are at all-time lows. All-time lows. You have the academic achievement gap, which has grown to its widest levels ever. Widest levels. And what do they do? Well, instead of tackling these disgraceful numbers, instead of tackling that, the Department of Education colludes with the Department of Justice to spy on parents that want to complain at school board meetings. That's what they do. And they routinely lower standards. So we spend over $1.2 trillion a year in education when you factor in the federal, state, and local spending from kindergarten to higher education. And what are we getting as a result? What's our return on investment? Well, it's many schools throughout the country, particularly in our cities, that are unable to produce a single student proficient in reading and math. It's shameful and it should be criminal. Not for nothing, but the education policymakers should not be anywhere near the education industry. They shouldn't have any say. But then again, we've allowed incompetent people to infect all aspects of government. It really is insane when you think about it. But we're going to take a quick commercial break, and I'll wrap up the episode when we get back. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So we covered a lot of ground today, from FEMA's failure during Hurricane Helene, the Department of Homeland Security's inability to protect the former president, the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Department of Education's disastrous handling of our children, And the common thread throughout these examples is clear. Our government is failing us. And it's not just about isolated incidents. It's systemic incompetence that runs through virtually every department and every single agency. And what's more alarming is that these failures come at an enormous cost, both financially and in terms of public trust. I've said before, it's not just about the wasted money, though trillions of tax dollars are being squandered away and should infuriate every single American, but it's also about our trust in the institutions that are supposed to serve us, they're supposed to protect us, and they're supposed to act within our best interest. They are public servants. They are there to serve the public. They are not benevolent dictators. And when that trust is broken, it becomes a serious threat to our republic that the Founding Fathers warned about. So where do we go from here? What do we do about this? Well, first and foremost, accountability is key. We need leaders who are not just ideologues or political appointees, but we need competent professionals who understand their responsibilities and are held accountable when they fail. It's really not complicated. We cannot afford to keep allowing incompetent individuals to occupy leadership positions while the American people suffer the consequences of their failures. Second, we have to start demanding transparency. We have to hold these agencies to higher standards. It's up to us, we the people, to push back against government overreach and inefficiency. And it's our duty to stay informed and stay engaged. We can't sit back and hope for change. We need to be the driving force behind it. And finally, it's time for a real conversation about reforming the federal government, whether it's dismantling agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, revamping the approach to education. It's clear that we can no longer continue down this path. Something has got to give. It's unsustainable, these types of failures. We have to rein it back in. Our government has a crisis of incompetence, but it doesn't mean that we can't fix it. Everything is fixable if we have the will to do what is necessary. And it starts with awareness and leads to action. So keep questioning the government and the officials, keep holding our leaders accountable, and most importantly, keep fighting for the America that we all believe in. Now, if you found the content of this episode informative, please give the P.A.S. report a 5-star rating. Take 30 seconds to write a review on any podcast platform that allows it. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll be back on Monday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.